The horizon of the Sahel no longer begins in silence. It trembles. A land once mapped by others now shifts beneath its own awakening, as if the soil itself is preparing to speak. Lines drawn by distant capitals loosen their grip. Old agreements lose their weight. And across the desert wind, a truth long buried under the dust of dependency rises like a forgotten seed, remembering the season that shaped it. Yet this awakening is not sudden. It is the echo of years in which caravans carried hope, while headlines carried doubt, years in which the world mistook patience for weakness and quiet for surrender. Now the Sahel stands at the edge of a new chapter, caught between those who rearrange their uniforms beyond its borders and those who reclaim their future within them. Something irreversible is taking shape, not an uprising of weapons, but an uprising of dignity. Not an argument for chaos, but a statement of sovereignty. And so a question emerges, sharper than any frontier line. If a region once dismissed as fragile begins to choose its own path, what horizon will it draw for the continent beyond? Stay with this story, because sovereignty is not a headline, it is a reckoning. The map of the Sahel has never been a quiet drawing. It shifts with every season, every convoy, every choice a nation makes when the world is watching and when the world looks away. For years, outsiders assumed this horizon would always bend the same way, always toward the capitals that once claimed to guard it. But the land remembers every footprint, and memory, when stirred, redraws the lines. After the departures from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, many believed the story had ended. Convoys rolled westward, flags were folded, statements were issued about new directions and mutual respect. But departures are never just departures in geopolitics. They are pauses in which strategies search for new corridors. This is how the idea of a ring was born. A ring not declared on platforms or carved in treaties, but assembled quietly along the southern flank of the Sahel. In Côte d'Ivoire, airfields once used for routine missions were reinforced to welcome larger aircraft, their hangars widened, their corridors extended. In Benin, instructors arrived with programs of partnership, yet the exercises mirrored more than training. They mirrored surveillance. In Togo, advisory teams expanded their presence under regional frameworks, mapping movement rather than simply assisting it. In Senegal, the coast offered a final pillar, a maritime echo of influence stretching inland. Together, these points formed a crescent, not a wall, but a watchtower, not an invasion, but a presence. It felt soft in language, firm in structure, and familiar in intention. For those who have lived through decades of external management, the design was not subtle, it was a repetition. But history rarely stays still long enough to serve the same blueprint twice. By 2024, murmurs began to rise along the coast. Côte d'Ivoire evaluated the cost of hosting a legacy it did not entirely choose. Senegal, long considered a reliable anchor for outside influence, announced a major shift, a request for troop withdrawals, a call to redefine partnership from the ground up. And Benin, once framed as a stable foothold, found itself shaken by internal disquiet, a reminder that a nation under pressure cannot serve as a perfect brick in someone else's wall. The crescent bent, its edges loosened. What was meant to encircle instead began to fracture. Yet the most profound change did not come from the coast. It came from the center, from the desert corridors, where the soil grows quiet before it speaks, from the capitals that once carried the weight of centuries and decided they would no longer carry it alone. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger did not simply expel old presences. They expelled old assumptions. They formed an alliance that moved beyond survival, beyond protest, and into authorship. Inside this shifting terrain, Ibrahim Traoré emerged not as a symbol of defiance for its own sake, but as a reminder that sovereignty is a discipline, not a declaration. His government questioned the logic of rings built around its borders. It questioned the meaning of cooperation that watches more than it supports. It questioned why stability must always be defined elsewhere. These questions reverberated across the region. They unsettled boardrooms. They irritated editorial desks. They forced diplomats to recalibrate their vocabulary. Because a ring is only effective when the center is still, but the center had begun to move. And when the center moves, the ring must adapt or break. Across the Sahel, new patrol routes formed along the borders not to provoke, but to signal intention. New agreements were drafted with partners who framed respect not as rhetoric but as a starting point. New communities, farmers, traders, miners, began to speak of the horizon not as a threat but as a canvas for choices long delayed. This was not resistance, it was realignment, a long-awaited shift from being the terrain of someone else's strategy to being the architect of its own future. Still, the question lingered. Why attempt a ring at all if the ground beneath it is no longer willing to hold the stakes? The answer lies in fear. Fear that a region once portrayed as dependent might discover its rhythm. Fear that nations long considered peripheral might become central to the continent's next chapter. Fear that sovereignty, once awakened, does not retreat. And so the crescent was drawn, and so the crescent strained. But the Sahel has always known that walls built in silence fall in silence. What stands is not the structure, but the will of the people it hoped to contain. If the ring around the Sahel is trembling, what shape will rise from its collapse? At the heart of the Sahel, something deeper than alliance is forming. It is not a treaty written in haste, nor a pact born from pressure, but a structure shaped slowly by the weight of shared memory. For decades, the countries of this region walked parallel paths, each carrying its own burdens, each confronting the same storms alone. And yet, when the world expected them to falter, they moved toward one another instead. The break with ECOWAS did not fall from the sky. It arrived after years in which sanctions were imposed without dialogue, expectations were voiced without understanding, and advice was offered without listening. To many beyond the Sahel, the withdrawal was abrupt. To those within it, the decision felt overdue. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger drew a line that was not meant to divide, but to clarify. A line that said sovereignty is not a performance to be graded by external observers. It is a responsibility carried by those who live with its consequences. The three nations did not reject the idea of regional cooperation. They rejected a structure that had ceased to reflect their lived realities. Thus, the alliance of Sahel states emerged, not as a rebellion against a neighbor, but as a refusal to remain in a room where their voices were measured by how closely they echoed distant capitals. The alliance became both shield and seed, shield against pressures that came dressed as concern, seed for a regional model grounded in mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. Inside each capital, change took different shapes. In Bamako, policy shifted toward the reclamation of economic levers. In Niamey, the control of resources became a central pillar of national intention. In Ouagadougou, the political horizon widened to include not only defense but dignity as an organizing principle. 3 paths, 3 histories, 3 governments. Yet the rhythm beneath them was the same. For the first time in years, borders that once felt like fractures became bridges. Joint patrols were planned, airspace coordination drafted, intelligence networks woven from threads once kept apart. A unified force of several thousand personnel was proposed, not to project power outward, but to stabilize the interior of a region long misread by those who never walked its roads. The significance of this shift was not lost on observers. Western reporters framed it as isolation. Regional critics called it divergence. But among the young across the Sahel, the alliance felt like recognition. Recognition that their nations were no longer waiting for regional institutions to accommodate them. They were building a new one that reflected their own rhythm. Universities in Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou began hosting debates on the meaning of sovereignty in the 21st century. Students discussed borders not as cages drawn by colonizers, but as responsibilities to be shaped by citizens. Market traders, long impacted by sanctions and trade restrictions, saw in the alliance the possibility of movement without the shadow of external approval. And elders, who had watched cycles of intervention and withdrawal for decades, recognized in the alliance a rare moment, the convergence of political will and popular sentiment. Still, the decision carried risks. Leaving ECOWAS meant stepping away from decades of legal frameworks, trade corridors, and diplomatic habits. It meant stepping into uncertainty, into territory that required new agreements to be drafted, new rules to be written, new bridges to be negotiated. But for the leaders of the Sahel, uncertainty felt less dangerous than stagnation. To many outside the region, the alliance appeared fragile. 3 nations facing economic strain, security challenges, and diplomatic pressure. But fragility was not the right word. What the world called fragile was in truth formative. The alliance was not a finished structure, it was scaffolding rising around a new vision. Every week brought a joint announcement, a coordinated patrol, a shared declaration, and with each step, the alliance shifted from symbolism to substance. This is what unsettled the old order, not the rhetoric, but the coherence, not the speeches, but the coordination, not the isolation, but the independence. Fragmentation was expected, unity was not, and so analysts abroad asked why 3 landlocked nations would leave a regional bloc that in theory offered economic opportunity and diplomatic support. The answer lay in the lived experience of those within the bloc. Support cannot be conditional on compliance. Opportunity cannot be traded for obedience, and solidarity cannot be achieved through sanctions. For the Sahel, the alliance became more than arrangement. It became declaration, a declaration that decades of being spoken for had concluded, a declaration that partnership would no longer come at the cost of self-respect, a declaration that the region's storms would be navigated by those who know its winds. But declarations invite consequences. They stir anxieties beyond the desert line. They challenge actors who build their reach on the assumption that the Sahel would always remain an object rather than an architect. If 3 nations can redraw their own map, what happens when the rest of the region begins to ask why they could not do the same? Beneath every nation lies a story older than its borders, a story told not in speeches, but in minerals, in rivers, in the veins of the earth that sustain a people long before any flag waves above them. For the Sahel, this story has always been intimate. Gold-shaped villages before governments were formed, uranium-lit cities far away, while towns near the mines lived in shadows. And recently, the world has begun to realize that the land beneath the Sahel is not merely soil, it was leverage. When Niger reclaimed the uranium fields that had operated for decades under foreign management, it did more than alter a contract. It altered a balance. The decision to take direct control of the Somaïr site reverberated through stock markets, energy boards, and diplomatic corridors. For years, the supply had traveled quietly from the north of Niger to reactors across the sea, turning desert ore into electricity that illuminated distant homes. But the communities near the mines saw little of that light, and when the government assumed full ownership, it was not framed as provocation, it was framed as restoration. The reaction abroad spoke volumes. Reports questioned the capacity of the local engineers. Commentators speculated about instability, yet few acknowledged the environmental grievances voiced by residents or the sense of justice felt by a nation reclaiming stewardship over a resource central to its identity. For Niger, taking control was not an act of defiance, it was an act of dignity. Mali's story followed a different path but echoed the same rhythm. Long known for its vast gold deposits, Mali witnessed an era in which foreign firms extracted immense value while the state struggled to transform those riches into broad prosperity. In recent years, however, a shift occurred. Policies tightened, oversight increased, revenue began to move inward, not outward. Gold that once traveled quietly across borders now fuels a different conversation: how a land famed for its heritage can shape its economic destiny. And then came Burkina Faso, where the earth holds not only gold, but the minerals of tomorrow: manganese, essential for industry, and lithium, essential for batteries, technology, and the future of energy. As the world races toward electrification, the global value of these minerals grows each day. Foreign companies sensed opportunity, but the nations sensed responsibility. Recent agreements place state participation at the center of every major project. Burkina did not shut its doors. It simply ensured that any open door led to mutual gain. When an international company received a license to operate a large gold site with the state retaining a meaningful stake, analysts abroad expressed concern about the message this sent. But in truth, the message was simple. The hands that guard the land must also share in its harvest. It was a shift from extraction to partnership, from concession to collaboration. Across the region, new corridors formed. Some were physical, roads paved by foreign engineers, trade routes that bypassed all choke points. Others were digital, data lines laid through agreements that focused on infrastructure, not interference. The Sahel was not isolating itself. It was reorganizing its connections. This is what unsettled those accustomed to older patterns. The fear is not that the region will fall into chaos, but that it will rise into coherence. A coherence that challenges established routes of profit. A coherence that questions why minerals essential to global industries should be priced abroad rather than valued at home. A coherence that asks whether development can ever be genuine if it does not honor the earth from which it grows. The narrative told for decades portrayed the Sahel as dependent on aid, on external expertise, on stabilizing forces from outside. But the movement of resources tells a different story. Every reclaimed mine, every renegotiated contract, every corridor redrawn in favor of local interest becomes an act of authorship, a people writing themselves back into their own ledger. Yet this path carries difficulties. When a region asserts ownership, it invites pressure. Reports emerge warning of a financial risk. Rating agencies hint at downgrades. Think tanks caution against national control of strategic assets. But beneath these warnings lies a deeper tension. Who benefits when resources travel outward? Who gains when they remain? The Sahel has chosen to explore the second question, not as rejection of external partnership, but as insistence on balance. Partnership does not require surrender. Cooperation does not require silence. And development does not require erasure of local agency. The world watches these choices with apprehension, not because they threaten global order, but because they threaten old habits. Habits in which wealth moved smoothly in one direction, while responsibility moved in another. Habits that framed extraction as assistance. Habits that turned the earth into a ledger written elsewhere. But habits can change, and when they do, the earth speaks once more in its own language. If the ground itself is reclaiming its story, what will those who once shaped it from afar do next? Across the wider world, the movements of the Sahel have not passed unnoticed. Every capital that once viewed the region as a distant frontier now watches it as a shifting center, a place where old assumptions loosen and new realities emerge. And with each shift, the reactions grow more revealing. Paris was the first to adjust its tone. Official statements emphasized stability, cooperation, shared interests, but beneath the language, a recalibration was underway. The strategy of firm presence gradually gave way to the politics of soft visibility. Schools, cultural programs, climate projects, partnerships framed as renewal rather than influence. It was not abandonment. It was adaptation, a recognition that uniforms no longer carried the same authority they once did. So the attire changed, even if the intention did not. Across the Atlantic, Washington followed a more cautious script. Public declarations affirmed respect for national choices, yet parallel briefings warned of unfamiliar partners and emerging corridors, shaping the region's future. The concern was not the alliances themselves, but the precedent they set, that nations could reorient their security and economic frameworks without seeking validation from traditional arbiters. The message was subtle but clear. Independence is acknowledged but not encouraged. Within West Africa, ECOWAS confronted its most complex challenge in years. The departure of 3 member states forced a reckoning with its own identity. Some nations argued for reconciliation, urging a new framework that might bring back the Sahel bloc. Others positioned themselves as anchors for international alignment, believing proximity to external partners promised stability. But on the streets, from Accra to Lagos, from Dakar to Abuja, the conversation was different. People debated not the legality of departure, but the legitimacy of expectation. Why must sovereignty feel conditional? Why must unity require obedience? Meanwhile, new voices entered the horizon. Moscow framed its presence through assurances of non-intrusion, offering support structured around mutual benefit rather than oversight. Beijing continued to build digital pathways and logistical arteries, investing in frameworks that connected the Sahel to the wider continent rather than to distant ports. Neither approached the region through nostalgia. Neither invoked history as leverage. Their appeal lay not in ideology, but in alternative. The convergence of these reactions created an unusual symmetry. Old actors trying to soften their steps, new actors widening the road, regional actors redefining the path itself, and through this the Sahel stood in the center, no longer as a crossroads to be crossed, but as a junction to be shaped. Yet every movement, every recalibrated tone, every quiet negotiation carried an unspoken urgency. Because when a region long managed by external design begins to design itself, it forces the world to confront a difficult truth. Influence that relies on habit cannot endure in the landscape learning to choose. And so the question that once circled the Sahel now circles the globe. If even distant powers must redraw their approach, what happens when the Sahel redraws its voice? Across the continent, the echo of the Sahel has traveled farther than any convoy, farther than any communique. It moves through classrooms where students debate futures once considered unreachable. It threads through markets where traders speak of opportunity, not as a rumor, but as something they can touch. It rises in community halls where elders recall past eras of promise and caution, weaving memory into guidance for a generation stepping into new terrain. For many beyond the desert line, the Sahel was once a distant idea, a headline framed in difficulty. But as the alliance matured, the region transformed into something unexpected, a mirror. A mirror in which other nations began to see their own deferred aspirations, their own unresolved questions about autonomy, partnership, and voice. Ghanaian students analyzed the reforms of neighboring states, wondering how institutional renewal might look at home. Kenyan engineers studied the new corridors being drafted across the Sahel, imagining how such designs could reshape East African trade. In Namibia and Tanzania, debates emerged about the meaning of national stewardship in a century defined by Dayton, minerals, and shifting alliances. What traveled was not policy. What traveled was possibility. For decades, Africa was spoken of as a set of crises or a cradle of resources. But the shift in the Sahel introduced a third narrative. Africa as a reasoning actor, a decision maker, a region that does not wait for validation to imagine its path. And when a region begins to imagine its path, it invites others to imagine theirs. This is why conversations in faraway cities now include the Sahel as a case study in self-determined development. Not perfect, not seamless, but deliberate. And deliberation, in a world accustomed to rushed prescriptions for African states, is itself revolutionary. Yet the awakening carries weight. New roads demand new maintenance. New alliances require new discipline. New expectations call for clarity, patience, and endurance. The region is not rising into comfort. It is rising into responsibility. Even so, the signal it sends remains powerful. A demonstration that transformation need not wait for unanimity, that 3 nations can step forward before others choose whether to follow. That change can begin as a contour on one horizon before it becomes a pattern across many. Some observers describe this moment as a phase, others as an anomaly. But across towns and cities from Dakar to Dar, a quieter phrase circulates: If a horizon can shift once, it can shift again. And beneath that phrase lies a deeper intuition that the story unfolding in the Sahel is no longer confined to its borders. It has become a reference point, a rhythm carried by those who believe the continent's future does not have to resemble its past. The winds of this shift do not roar. They move steadily, patiently, gathering strength not from spectacle but from conviction. Conviction that identity is not inherited from outside. Conviction that dignity is not negotiable. Conviction that a continent can learn to walk its own road at its own pace. And if one region dares to rewrite its trajectory, what might a continent become when its many horizons begin to rise in unison? Africa has walked through seasons in which its truth was faltered through distant voices, its choices weighed against expectations it did not write, its horizons interpreted as illustrations in someone else's atlas. But the Sahel now stands as a reminder that a horizon is not a boundary, it is a beginning. And beginnings rarely ask for permission. Across Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, a rhythm long subdued has begun to steady itself. It rises not from triumph, but from discipline, not from defiance, but from the quiet certainty that dignity cannot be delegated. This is the rhythm that breathes through communities reclaiming their resources, through institutions learning to speak in their own cadence, through people recognizing the worth of their land and the weight of their voice. In this landscape, Ibrahim Traoré does not appear as a solitary figure, but as one thread in a wider tapestry, one that stretches across deserts, forests, coastlines and cities, where generations have waited for the chance to choose their own direction. His messages resonate not because they are loud, but because they articulate the sentiment many held in silence, that sovereignty must be lived, not requested. And as this message travels, it becomes larger than the man who spoke it. It becomes a signal carried by thousands, reflected in the steady rise of the Sahel's collective will. This moment matters not only for the three nations that shaped it. It matters for Africa, a continent often framed as a promise deferred. Because if a region once dismissed as peripheral can redraw its place in the world, then every nation that watches from afar must ask where its own horizon begins. The shift is neither sudden nor complete, but it is real. And reality, once awakened, does not return to sleep. The world may continue to reinterpret the Sahel through its own anxieties, yet the region's trajectory is no longer governed by those interpretations. It is governed by the hands that till its soil, guard its borders, mine its minerals, craft its policies, and shape its future. Through these hands, Ibrahim Traoré becomes less a symbol of resistance and more a reminder that leadership, at its core, is the courage to articulate what a people already know. So the question that rises at the edge of this chapter is simple. If one region can reclaim its breath, how far might the breath travel when lifted by a continent ready to remember itself? Stay with this horizon. Its next movement may belong to all who choose to listen.